Hi, welcome to zebracode.io. This is a free coding curriculum for high school students, and in Lesson 7 we learned about lists, and in Lesson 8 we're going to be learning about functions. Now functions allow us to essentially take a complex problem and break it into smaller parts. Now there are many benefits of functions, so let's go ahead and take a look at a few of them. They include, first, reusable code. So we can take our code now, if we're performing a similar idea, we can pass in different parameters, and we'll learn about these keywords and have different outputs. So we can reuse our code, we can take a complex problem and break it into smaller pieces. That allows us easier to program. We can take work and divide it among different developers, so we can assign different tasks to different people, and it's much easier to take a function and test the program for accuracy, and then we can build those components back together and build a more complex program. So we're getting to the point where we can actually design and architect some really complex problems and solve them. Now, key idea with functions, it has input and output, and we often think of a function as a black box. Now all of the inputs are going to be parameters, and we'll get into the keywords soon, and all of the outputs are going to be the return value. Now here's an example of how we declare a function. We start off first with a def, and that's a keyword which says that we are defining a function. Then we have the function name, and this is in quotations here, but it's not normally in quotations, and it represents any unique name as you would name a variable. And I often recommend calling it something like a verb, like calculate the product is one of the examples we'll talk about. And in parentheses are all the parameters. The parameters represent the inputs. Now the inputs can be a list, it can be integers, it can be string, any of the data structures we've learned so far, and it could be one or multiples. Here are three examples of defining a function. So they all start off with the keyword def, which means it's defining. And the first one is prime, so that's the function name. And then in parentheses, we have the parameter. In this case, it has one parameter, and it's a number. So we can assume here that this is going to input a number, and it's going to determine whether it's going to return either true or false. So we'll get more into the function itself. The second example is, again, def, and the name of the function is add, and it has two parameters. So we can assume maybe that this takes these two parameters, a and b, and it calculates it, adds them together, and returns the add value. Finally, in the third example, we have a function name called calcAverage, and the input is a num list. So we can assume here that perhaps the input is a list of numbers here, and the output is going to be the calculated average. So those are three examples. Next, let's define a couple of terms. All of the parameters, those are the inputs, and they can be, again, many parameters, or it could be one parameter, or it could be zero parameters, and parameters can be lists, they can be strings, they can be integers, they can be floats, they can be any of the data structures we learned. Now, similarly, the output is the return value, and return values can be more than one, but the return value similarly can be a list, it can be a string, it could be integer, and it could be a float. Let's take a look at a specific example. Now, first of all, the input is a list of numbers. Now, this is a comment, and notice the input in the parameters is called num list, and the output is the product. So here we have a function defined as calculate or calc product, and the input is a list of numbers. Now, we do some more code, and notice all the code is indented. P equals 1, or it's assigned the value of 1, and then we iterate through the num list, and then we calculate P. P is assigned the value of P times X, and then return P, and P is going to be the product of all of the numbers in the num list. So think about this as inputs and outputs. The inputs are the parameters. In this case, we have a list of numbers as the parameters, and the output is P, and P is going to be the product. And the name is called calc product, or it calculates the product of all of these numbers. Next, let's look at how we would call this function that we've just created. So we have a list, and a list is assigned the value of 2, 3, 5, and 1. Now here's our function name, calc product, and its parameter is this list. It's a list of numbers, and the return value then is assigned the value of prod. That's our variable here within our main program that has that value, or the return value of the function. Now that we have the return value of the function stored in our variable called prod, P-R-O-D, we can print the results out, the product is, and concatenate it with the accordingly results. Now, let's look at another example of calling a function, and we've done this before in the last section. We can import random, which means we're importing a new module, and within that code, within that module, we have a function, essentially, randint. So we've seen this idea before. In this case, randint accepts two parameters, 1 to 6, and then it returns a value, including the endpoints, and we can print that value out. As a reminder, all the code in these concept videos are in the slides link, so you can cut and paste this code and make sure it works as expected. Now, a final concept with functions is the difference between local and global variables, and you should always think of functions as local variables. That is, the parameters that come into the function, they are only available within the function itself. The only thing that comes into the function is the parameters, and the only thing that comes out of the function is the return value or return values. So think of those as local variables. That is, they only exist within the confines of the function and don't exist within the larger calling program or the main program that might be calling that function. You can also have functions that call functions that call functions. So there's no limits to how you can design and architect your problems into different ways and use creative problem solving. Thank you. This is zebracode.io. This is lesson 8, and we're focused on user-defined functions.